Good afternoon. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. So happy to have you here with us as part of today's program. I want to thank and acknowledge Atia Thurman and David Blount of the Clark Fox Policy Institute, who are going to be moderating the Q&A for today's panel. I'm also in the chat responding to questions and comments that the audience may have. So great team we have supporting the event. For folks joining us on Zoom, I just want to remind you that using the webinar format, we are not able to see or hear you. Your cameras are disabled, your microphones, but the chat feature is enabled, and that's how you jump into this conversation, and we definitely want you to be a part of it. Also want to note that we are not able to call on raised hands, so that feature is not so helpful. To folks joining us on YouTube, welcome. We're glad you're here, and we don't have a way to directly include your questions in the conversation today. Before we get started, I just want to let you know what's coming up next week for Open Classroom. Next week is Maternal Mental Health Awareness Week, and Open Classroom is partnering again with the Clark Fox Policy Institute. It's going to be the Janet and Atia show for two events that we're doing together. On Tuesday, May the 4th, Washington University alum Ariel Wilderman is going to be joined by Dr. Diane Sanford, delivering a program called The Worst Kept Secret, raising awareness about maternal mental health. And then on Thursday, May the 6th, we have a fantastic panel called We Are Not Broken, Why Equity Matters in Maternal Mental Health, and that's going to be moderated by Brown School Assistant Professor Tyresa Howard-Howell. So if you're interested in those programs, we're still receiving registrations. I'll throw a link in the chat, and we would certainly love to have you with us. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome McCall Grinston-Weiss, who's the Shanti Kekinduka Distinguished Professor at the Brown School. She's also the Director of Washington University Social Policy Institute. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you for all of you all joining us today for this important event. And thank you for my colleague at the Clark Fox Policy Institute for organizing this discussion and for elevating family well-being and racial equity. The last 100 days have been marked with deep emotions of both hope and challenge. On one end, the Biden administration enacted policies on topics we will hear more about today, such as providing economic relief to families and putting us on a path to recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other end, the last 100 days have been filled with grief as our country grapples with addressing systematic racism and filled with uncertainty as children have been learning at home and families faced with stark levels of financial, housing, and food insecurity. But it is the people attending this event and the incredible panelists, Serena, Nisha, and Stephen, and all of you that give me great hope that the future of both our nation and the St. Louis region is bright. I hope we leave this discussion today even more energized and committed to make an impact in our region and work collaboratively on a path forward. I will now turn it over to our event moderators, Atia and David.
Thank you so much, McCall. So welcome. Thank you again for being here. We're going to get straight into the conversation here. I appreciate McCall's welcome remarks and Janet for opening this, and I'm going to turn it over fairly shortly to my co-moderator, David. But I want to remark on the fact that today is marking the 100 days since the new administration took office. And 100 days is not a long time. Not at all, right? In the grand perspective of things, it's a very short period of time. But in that short period of time, we've seen some significant movement toward addressing immediate priorities, including COVID-19, the economy, healthcare, and racial equity. Specifically, we've seen vaccination administration has steadily improved in scale and efficiency. I think about 1/3 of American adults are now fully vaccinated, or the American population. We saw the passing of the American Rescue Plan. Several $100 million of that is going to come to the St. Louis area. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And then we're also, we're not going to have a lot of time to get to it, but we have two more major proposals coming from this administration: the American Jobs Plan, historic investment to generate jobs and to repair the infrastructure of this nation, and the American Families Plan, another substantial investment in children, families, and the future of our nation. So thank you. My name is Atia Thurman. I'm Associate Director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. I'm really grateful for everyone who's today. I'm grateful for the chance to have this conversation, and I'd like to turn it over to my co-moderator, David Blount. David.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. In addition to the context already shared, we also recognize the need for ongoing critical human-centered responses and healing during this time. And from the various levels of stress and insecurities caused by the pandemic, the loss of life, trauma, violence, interpersonal and systemic, we need to hear, see, and hold each other and those most vulnerable in our communities right now. And in reflecting on these 100 days, we hope to really envision and enact a healthier and more equitable future. I'm David C. Blount, an MSW candidate at the Brown School and Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you all. So thank you all.
And if we could invite our panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the focus of their work, how they think families are faring as a result of the pandemic and the recession, and their reflection on the impacts of the Biden-Harris administration's 100 days so far. Serena?
So my name is Serena Mohammed. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. And we have a lot that we're going to try to cover in our opening statements, but just to give you some context as to why I'm on the panel, I serve as the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the St. Louis Mental Health Board, as well as the Managing Director of the COVID-19 Regional Response Team. So in my work, I focus on regional cross-sector collaboratives that are really trying to address complex social issues. In the case of MHB, it's children's mental health and violence prevention. In the case of RRT, it's the social service response to the pandemic. So when I think about how families are faring in our region as a result of the pandemic and the recession, I know that we have some economic mobility experts on the panel that will talk about the economic insecurity and housing instability that many families have faced. One thing that I hear when I'm speaking to colleagues as well as community members is that there is a crisis looming around unmet mental health needs that have impacted families. Many people are experiencing anxiety, stress, and depression at an unimaginable scale. And we don't really understand fully the long-term impacts of the trauma that we're all living through. We're all trying to cope and respond to a crisis while we're in the midst of that crisis, which is very unusual. And it hits different for different people. For some, it's the economic insecurity that's driving their trauma. Families have lost income, lost homes, been unable to access the food that they're accustomed to with no real end in sight. And others are suffering from isolation and literal fear of being in proximity to their normal support networks. So you could do a whole panel just on virtual learning and how that's impacted teachers as well as students. So there are all of these mental health implications that I think we need to be paying attention to see how they unfold over the years to make sure that we have the appropriate supports in place to respond to what's happening. When I think about the first 100 days, the thing that makes me optimistic is that we have been learning as we've been responding to this crisis. So as we get these pledges of resources and as we understand the different plans that have been enacted at the federal level, it gives us an opportunity locally to start to hold systems accountable and to start to think about what we should be doing differently to actually build the type of infrastructure we need for equitable recovery. So it's an opportunity to take what we've experienced and really use it to build a better future with the resources that are available to us now. So even though we're in the middle of this, there is, if there feels like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think people are optimistic about what we can do to reinvent our region as a result of these resources.
Hi everyone, I'm Nisha Patel. It's wonderful to be here. I am a senior fellow at the Social Policy Institute at WashU, and I'm also the other hat I wear is an independent consulting practice, and much of my work entails serving as an advisor to a range of philanthropies that are working on social and economic mobility, and in particular work that brings a strong racial equity lens and often a place-based focus. So that's, I often think I'm the person behind the scenes advising people who are supporting people to influence policy. And in terms of how families, particularly in the St. Louis region, but also nationally, are faring in this pandemic and recession, I would say we really have to look to some of the great, actually, survey work that I think Stephen will probably talk about that SPI has done and others have done to lift up voices and perspectives of families if we rely on just, we'll talk a lot about economic security, but if we rely on economic indicators like GDP or people's stock portfolios or, large companies' returns, things look really great, right? But those are not those indicators that we often see in the paper are not the ones we should be looking at. And I think from my conversations with families and with organizations who are working at the grassroots, who are doing the mutual aid work, who are doing the organizing, folks are struggling, and in particular folks there were folks struggling before there was a pandemic, before there was a recession. They've been the hardest hit, and particularly families of color with low income. I think that won't surprise anyone in our audience. We've got a bunch of folks that are engaged in social change. This, but the tiny optimist, that young Brown School student, I'm a Brown School grad that lives inside me, remains optimistic as well, because help is on the way in the form of, might not be perfect, it's pretty good, in the form of the American Rescue Plan, and I think it has the potential to bring much needed relief to many. And in terms of this first 100 days, even though it's early days, we're already starting to see the impact of that relief take shape. And I'll focus just on kind of three things I think I want to highlight in terms of economic relief. The direct cash. From where I sit, there is nothing more effective or efficient than direct cash that provides agency and autonomy to families, and in the form of economic impact payments, expanded unemployment benefits, and hopefully soon, a large number of families will be receiving the advanced and expanded child tax credit, which I think we'll get more into in the conversation. And then food, which Serena hit on, SNAP and school meals, the increase in those SNAP benefits, the amount of the benefits, and the extended flexibility to provide school meals to children is going to go a long way to combat hunger. And then finally, rental assistance, super important provision. It remains to be seen how all that's going to be implemented and rolled out in each local community. But when these moratoriums on evictions end, it's going to be even more important. Like, I don't know who has 12 months worth of money to pay back rent. So we've got to make sure that those supports get into the hands of families that really need them.
Great. So, hi, folks. Stephen Rowland. I'm an assistant professor of research at the Brown School and at the Social Policy Institute. And my primary focus is on the economic security of economically marginalized populations. So a lot of times that takes the work of large-scale survey research, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. But a lot of times, and some of the best parts of my job actually involve taking a lot of the theory that comes from the economics world and the psychology world, and actually figuring out ways of applying that theory in community organizations, in governments, in the private sector, testing these things through field experiments to figure out what actually works in terms of providing these economic security interventions or policy reforms in these populations that acutely need it. So in terms of how I think families in our region are faring during this pandemic, well, the good news is that Missouri as a whole is doing fairly similar to the US as a whole. We're not doing any worse than the average state, right? The bad news, of course, is that the US and Missouri by extension is doing pretty poorly in terms of these indicators. So just some brief framing around this. Half of Missourians lost employment income early in the pandemic. The unemployment rate quadrupled, basically, within a month. And that's very acute. And a lot of these effects persisted almost over the course of 2020. And this translated into extremely high rates of housing insecurity and food insecurity relative to where they were pre-pandemic, as well as many other indicators. Just that's what we really got good data on right now. In St. Louis as a whole, our numbers tend to track Missouri's numbers as a whole. So again, it's great to hear that we're not doing exceptionally badly, but in a period where everyone is doing exceptionally badly, that's not that much of a silver lining. One thing that we don't have good data on here in Missouri or in St. Louis is on the disparate impacts of the pandemic on economically vulnerable groups. That's coming, I'm sure, but we just don't have good data on it yet. But we know from the national research that there are so many different groups out there that were just bludgeoned by this pandemic. low-income households, parents, especially parents of young children, families of color, gig workers and frontline workers all took the brunt of this thing. These numbers show up in our data. It's sometimes unreal just how much of a disparity there is between these groups of folks and, you know, the general population. But despite that, I think the theme of the day is, what I'm hearing is perhaps cautious optimism, perhaps very cautious optimism. I too am cautiously optimistic after the administration's first 100 days. We've seen a more assertive public response than we saw after the Great Recession, which says to me that the lessons have been learned around going too big relative to going too small. We've seen this administration combine well-established approaches to providing policy support. So things like, you know, SNAP expansions or support for state and local governments, with some pretty interesting policy innovations that we're going to talk about later today. And they're doing so in a way that does actually emphasize equity issues. So racial and ethnic equity issues, gender equity issues, parenthood equity issues, things like that. So it's pretty encouraging for me as a social policy researcher to be doing this work in a period where there's a lot of social policy innovation going on. And it's also encouraging to me as a St. Louisan because, you know, with the money and the support that this city is going to be getting, one of the great things about doing this work here is there are so many organizations that are doing really creative, really inspiring work. So having this opportunity in this moment to work with those organizations and just see their work, I think is very, very encouraging for the future.
Thank you. Really gave us a great kind of like perspective overall, both in terms of the context of our region and the context of the nation and the time period that we're in also. Speaking of that time period, we just, you know, we crossed the 1-year anniversary for the pandemic a couple months ago. So we're into about 14, 15 months here since it was declared a pandemic. And so I know and really a huge priority right now for many of us is still just the health needs and getting, and honestly, the turn from, you know, protecting ourselves, continue to protect ourselves, and then moving towards this vaccination program. So I want to invite Serena back into this conversation. We've passed this year mark. What are the top priorities for the regional response team at this moment in time? And what supports from the federal government have been most critical?
So for us, equitable recovery is our top priority. This actually means addressing the underlying issues that led to the disproportionate impact of COVID that we see on, you know, Black, Indigenous communities of color, immigrants and refugees. The good news is that the community has been very clear about the priorities that we should be addressing. So if we're listening to community members, they've been clear about what's not working and what should be done differently. And this is prior to the pandemic. So even before the pandemic, if you looked at any needs assessment, it will talk about barriers to access, such as transportation, childcare, not having paid leave. What the pandemic did was it allowed everyone else to experience what marginalized communities have lived with on a regular basis. So even if we weren't listening before or we didn't believe it before, now we have firsthand experience of what economic instability feels like, what it means to not have your traditional access to education, what social isolation can do to you. All of those inequities we've at some point had the opportunity to experience. So what that means now is that there should be a larger army responding, feeling responsible for starting to correct some of these systems failures. It's not just on the communities that have been disproportionately impacted. All of us should be kind of standing together to work on these things. So we focused as the regional response team on really supporting a centralized system for equitable distribution of resources. So what that means is we look at the fragmentation that exists, some of the challenges that we have in our traditional service delivery model, and we try to come up with improvements that address some of those issues that families experience when they're having difficulty getting their needs met in the existing system the way that it is. We do this through our ongoing PPE distribution. So that's something that we've been doing since March of 2020, and we haven't stopped doing that because we still have those same urgent needs, especially in our social service sector, folks who work in childcare, who are family facing, they still need those protections. And we're also looking at the way that the vaccine education is being handled. So we've decided to focus primarily on informed choice, but we understand that there are groups that are trying to get information out to the community about vaccines so that there could be some conversation around vaccine hesitancy. So our role is to really emphasize the importance of not making it a transactional relationship, recognizing that people are hesitant for a reason, and then doing the difficult work that it takes to rebuild trust so that people can make the decision that is best for them. So we really prioritized listening to what the community is saying are their greatest concerns or needs, and then building our response around that. And then the last piece that I'll touch on is the eviction prevention. So I think Nisha mentioned the fact that a moratorium doesn't mean that debt goes away. And when these moratorium are lifted, we're going to have families who probably were in a position where they were already struggling, now having to come up with more than 12 months of rent, utilities, and all of these other debts that have accumulated. And if our system is not set up in such a way that we reach those families early, no amount of relief is going to dig them out of the hole that they may be in. So we're really prioritizing figuring out how to determine where the needs are, and to make sure that we're getting to people with the greatest level of need first, so that they're not even further behind as we start to administer some of these relief dollars.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on, can I follow up with a question? And we have the same question that I think Wendy posted in the chat. And it's really, if you want to comment on how might the failure of the Missouri government to fund them. So you talked about listening to the people and responding to the greatest need and shoring up the systems as we sort of get into this next phase of really the pandemic and the recovery period. So how might the failure of the Missouri government to fund the Medicaid expansion impact our region's ability to respond to COVID-19 and to recover over time?
So it's definitely going to have an impact on access to healthcare. So, I mean, it's just stating the obvious that people who don't, that can't take off from work, that can't get appointments if they feel like they may be sick, that may not decide to get tested because a positive test could impact their ability to work. All of those things are wrapped up in how secure you feel in your ability to get medical treatment or medical help when you need it. And the further you move that away from people, it exacerbates some of the risk-taking behaviors that some folks have to engage in because of their ability to, because it impacts their ability to work. So not having that safety net, I think, creates an additional layer of risk for folks who don't have access to medical care. But the question about how it impacts the people who mobilized, what I'm hoping is that when you look at the overall landscape, so not just that specific thing, people are starting to see locally and nationally that organizing is moving the needle. And I'm hoping that they will take the cue from things that have been successful to not give up on pushing for Medicaid expansion. So if the next step is a legal battle, then people are paying attention and they're engaged in that. If the next step is to start to vote people out of office, then they're paying attention and they're engaged in that. So I'm optimistic that it won't be kind of a final blow or so discouraging that folks don't recover, but it does significantly set us back in our ability to make sure that people get the health care that they need.
Could I just jump in with one point on that? Because I mean, Serena's absolutely right in these impacts, but one of the things that gets lost in the conversation about like the relationship between health insurance access and economic health in general, but the economic health after the pandemic, is the fact that your healthcare system and your economy are fundamentally intertwined at both an individual and a social level. And so a lot of times we talk about, well, people deserve access to affordable care, they deserve access to good care, it should be a human right. All of those are true, but you can also make a good economic development argument for this as well, which is that healthcare expansion, Medicaid expansion rather, and public health insurance systems in general and the marketplaces have been associated in our work and other work with reductions in housing volatility, more stable employment, obviously reductions in bankruptcy, increases in the ability to save, decreases in other types of debt, all these things that nominally we say we care about as a society, good stable employment, good income, saving, all these things. And yet, you know, whenever we get the opportunity to erect sort of a public health insurance system, Medicaid or what have you, to try to help families actually pursue this type of stability and this type of economic mobility practices, it gets taken away from us. And so to me, it's like you cannot disentangle this question about economic development from healthcare systems, and people just don't discuss it nearly enough.
To go on that point, I think that's perfect, and wanted to hear what you've been learning from the research, along with what current approaches you think should be highlighted or elevated, given sort of that context and knowing that that's an argument we should probably be using.
Yeah, so at the Social Policy Institute, over the last year, we've been conducting what we call the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 survey to track a lot of this stuff. So just a very brief background on this survey. So we've administered it in every quarter since last April. It's nationally representative. We survey about 5,000 people per wave. And in the survey, we ask very detailed questions about their work and financial situation, both before and during COVID, and how COVID has impacted their well-being in a lot of different domains. And what this survey has really revealed to me, sort of building off my earlier point, is just how unprepared we were as individuals and as a society for a crisis of this magnitude. And over the last 12 years, and especially for the last 8 years, I think you heard a lot of really good news about the economy and like the financial press and things like that. Nisha referred to some of this earlier, the GDP growth, the stock market growth, the unemployment numbers. Okay, great. But all this positive news really concealed some fundamental issues in the economy. Serious asset poverty. What I mean by that is huge swaths of the population could barely afford to cover even a modest expense without going into debt. Massive wealth inequality that we haven't seen since the Gilded Era. Stagnant wages combined with high debt burdens, particularly student debt. A decrease in job quality. Sure, you get a low unemployment rate, but quite frankly, the jobs are becoming more precarious, lower pay, lower benefit, skyrocketing healthcare and childcare costs, all combined with an underfunded social safety net. This is basically like a perfect storm, right? Where at an individual level, people don't have the job quality required to save money for themselves. So when they lose a job, then they have to fall back on an anemic social safety net. And so then the pandemic hit, and what happened? Well, we found that massive rates of job loss led to incredibly high rates of hardship. People who lost their jobs experienced 2 to 3 times higher rates of food insecurity, eviction, and so on. We found that a quarter of parents actually reported they lost a job purely due to a lack of childcare. That's just a quarter losing a job only to a lack of childcare, irrespective of other COVID-related issues. And then we found that, okay, well, the system's supposed to respond. We've got these automatic stabilizers to kick in for these folks, except what did we see? Half of those folks who needed unemployment early in the pandemic could not get through the system. Either they tried to apply and hadn't heard back, or they couldn't even get through to a human being to apply, right? That's 50% of those that needed it. Okay, well, we've got the stimulus, right? Stimulus is universal, it's going out to everybody. What did we find? We found that the people that got the stimulus quickly, high income, white, older, already had assets. So who's waiting? Younger, poorer, people more precarious employment, racial and ethnic minorities, right? So they're waiting long. And you see that, and then you see that the pre-pandemic savings, people with low pre-pandemic savings were so much more vulnerable. And so the asset poor just really had almost unbelievably higher rates of hardship. So you had all these different things. The economy was almost like a dry tinderbox, right? And COVID was just like a lightning bolt that just set it all aflame. So to me, what does this mean for the recovery? Well, simply put, it's insufficient to return to normal. If we can have 12 years of economic growth and record high Dow Jones industrial averages and still be in this position after all of that, then what we were doing was fundamentally flawed prior to the pandemic, and we need to do it better. And so my simple hope here is that discussions like this, work like ours, work like other folks, alert policymakers to the fact that economic growth without an equity focus is going to leave a society vulnerable to both small scale and large scale crises for the foreseeable future.
I would I would love to hear Nisha build on those points around some of those fundamental flaws, especially the freight safety net. And I'm curious your thoughts on overall the degree that the safety net is frayed, but also who's most impacted by those insufficient and inequitable sort of systems in itself.
Yeah, that's a great setup, Stephen. So thank you for me to dive into something I love to get on my soapbox about, which is how frayed our safety net is. So Stephen already talked about unemployment insurance, which, you know, these systems are, they're designed to keep people out. Like, it just seems like that. No, but it actually is. What does it people in technology say? That if something is this prevalent, like, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a feature of these systems. They're designed to keep as few people getting access to them as possible. So like unemployment insurance, there's the clunkiness of the state systems, just that the technology is old, not easy to access, but also in terms of state coverage pre-pandemic, for many states doesn't include part-time workers, doesn't include gig economy workers, doesn't include people who are self-employed. It's a whole lot of folks who are left out. And then I talked about at the beginning how, okay, cash, we know, it's very clear that the direct cash is one of the most effective, efficient ways to support families with emergency assistance in a crisis, right? Like, why do you think when there's a natural disaster, they say, don't send money, right? Like, that's what you hear from the Red Cross and other disaster relief organizations. So what do we have in terms of our safety net? So we have TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which most people are probably, policy wonks to be familiar with. If you're not, it's what people would think of as our quote, welfare to work program. It is a potential source of direct cash assistance and emergency aid for families with children in times of need, but only about 900,000 families in the whole country, I think most people don't realize, get access to that cash assistance, right? Less than 1 million families. And even though we think of this as the welfare to work program, it's about $30 billion between state and federal funds. Very little of that money is actually going to welfare, to cash assistance, or to work. Only about 21% goes to cash assistance. Very few families get it. And less than 10% is spent on employment and training. So where's the rest of that money going? The purposes are really broad. It's essentially become a slush fund for states that they use for all different kinds of things. And Missouri, I looked at the most recent data that's available for Missouri to bring it back to the region. Missouri spends less than 9% on cash assistance. And for every 100 families with children who are living in poverty in Missouri, only 11 received cash assistance. These are pre-pandemic numbers, okay? So when I say people were struggling before, one of the reasons they were struggling, massive holes in the safety net. So then we can look at a program like SNAP, formerly known as Food Stamp, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That reaches a lot more people than TANF does. And in fact, 38 million people in the United States. So 12% of the US population actually receives SNAP right now. In Missouri, SNAP reaches 700,000 people. And TANF reaches 8,700 people, 8,700 families, excuse me. So you can compare, vast difference. So the reach is better, but then think about what does that provide you if you have an EBT card for SNAP? Well, you can only use that resource to pay for food. So what if you need to buy diapers? What if you need to buy school supplies in a pandemic? What if you need to put gas in your car to be able to get to healthcare, to be able to get to a job if you're an essential worker? What if you need to pay your rent? Good luck, bad luck, because you can't use that benefit for that. You can't use SNAP for that. You can't use it for cleaning supplies, for masks, PPE, soap, hand sanitizer. So I think my bottom line here is there are massive gaping holes in the safety net. And in terms of who's most impacted, I think Stephen hit on it in his opening remarks. It is young children with young parents who are most likely to be experiencing poverty and hardship, particularly mothers of color and their children. Things were not great in before times, and the pandemic has only exacerbated it. Second, women who've been disproportionately hit by job loss, and even women who had, maybe you wouldn't, by the federal definition, say they were in poverty, maybe they had a more moderate income, have had to either reduce hours or leave their jobs to take on the larger burden of caregiving, of parenting responsibilities, of supervising remote learning. So there are definitely both disproportionate race and gender impacts here. And then specifically Black workers, I would lift up because, you know, I think Stephen talked about before, you know, that we supposedly have these programs that are counter-cyclical that are tied to triggers. So it's like, oh, when unemployment goes up, then we can have things like unextended benefits. But they're tied to overall numbers. They're not using a racial equity lens. And if they were, we would look at, well, what's the Black unemployment rate? And you can track that over the past 5 decades, and it is 2x the white unemployment rate always, even in a so-called tight labor market. And so whether or not there's an overall economic crisis, there's always a crisis for Black workers. And I think that really is something for us to think about when we think about, you know, opportunities for new policy proposals. Again, it goes back to what are the indicators? How are we measuring poverty and hardship in our community? And if we're using a race equity lens, we need to have some different triggers that we're looking at that say people are hurting. And if you look at things overall, it looks good. But when you dig into the data, you can see who is disproportionately impacted. And we need to have policy responses and safety nets that take that into account.
That's great. And let's talk about one of those policy responses that we've seen, which is the American Rescue Plan. And it's a $1.9 trillion bill. We're seeing assistance for housing, nutrition, really thinking about childcare and affordable health care, but also unemployment insurance, along with many other things. But one of the biggest things we talked about was to cash assistance was the stimulus checks. And what does it mean to think about the willingness to do cash payments directly to families now? I'm curious your thoughts on the intention behind those stimulus checks in this bill, who it benefited, as I think Stephen touched on a bit, but ultimately, do you think this could be an opportunity to really redefine or change the narrative around where direct payments or cash payments really play in alleviating poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intention was immediate relief. Like, again, going back to it is the most efficient way and the most effective way, because family can then decide, do I need additional money to pay for food? Do I need to pay my rent? Do I need to pay someone to care for my children because I've got to go out to my essential job? It's the ultimate flexibility, autonomy and flexibility for families. And then, you know, in terms of, if you look at who benefited, the vast majority of Americans. Now, there were people that are left out, and Stephen's got great data that highlights that. So the vast majority of Americans, low income and moderate and even like kind of above that, benefited, right? Like in those first payments, folks making up to $95,000 for a single person, and for couples, you know, essentially double that amount. So it went fairly high up in terms of the income chain, but it benefited more than just the households that received those payments, because, you know, there is kind of a spin-off effect, because that is an infusion of resources into a community. And guess what? People who don't have a lot tend to spend that money. People who have a little bit more may be able to save it. But if you've got to pay rent now and pay for food now, where is that money going? It's going into your local economy. It's going into local businesses. That is in turn helping keep people employed, helping keep small businesses open. And so I think that's something that we have to recognize. And in terms of, like, you know, is there now an appetite to think about, you know, something like a guaranteed income, for example, or something longer term recurrent payments? I think, as you know, folks pointed out earlier, there were, you know, people who perhaps hadn't experienced that type of hardship who have in the last year. And so I do think we've seen political will and sentiment around this shift over time. Now, we may be in a moment, the American public's memory tends to be short. So I think we're in a moment where we got to move, while there is empathy and understanding for the need for this type of, I mean, I'll call it, you know, stronger safety net. I would put it in that category. And I think that, you know, I think we'll get into maybe later in the conversation, the expanded child tax credit. You know, that is for a subset of families, for families with children, particularly families with young children. There seems to be some momentum around those types of recurrent payments. And so, you know, I think about this more, it's sad that it took a crisis for us to get here, but I think about, you know, I've been at this for 25 years since I was at the Brown School, and some of these policy ideas were probably things we talked about in the classroom as kind of pie in the sky ideas, but there hasn't been a policy window up until now to be able to move them. And it feels like, boy, it feels like we're in one, and we got to move. Like we all have to mobilize and move, because I don't know if this moment will be here a year, 2 years from now. So I'm optimistic, but I also think there's an urgency. We can't take for granted that, oh, we got like 6 months or a year to work on this. No, we got to move now.
No, I think that's part of the urgency we're seeing with this administration too. I mean, there was a lot of movement in the first 100 days, especially while they enjoyed some bipartisan support in the American Rescue Plan. Now we're coming up against some of the more difficult, challenging aspects of some of these economic recovery proposals. I want to jump right into sort of, because I'm aware of the time and this conversation is just amazing, but I want to jump a little bit into, I want to ask Serena if she wants to comment at all on like the healthcare component of the American Rescue Plan before we do really want to address childcare, children in general, childcare as the tax credit, their own income tax credit, but anything about, I know very little about this, a couple of provisions around healthcare that came out of the American Rescue Plan. Is it enough? Is it enough for the people in our region, especially if we don't get Medicaid expansion?
So I warned you that this question might be a downer because of what happened with Medicaid expansion. And I don't know that it will be enough because the thing about the way funding flows is at the federal level, they can put the best plans in place imaginable. But if it's awarded to the state and then the state puts their restrictions or regulations on it, and then it comes down to the local level and there are additional layers added. That's kind of what we saw with the CARES Act funding that was so challenging. So each layer of government or each layer of bureaucracy that steps in creates another barrier to access. So I would say at this point, based on what we've experienced so far with how these federal dollars have actually reached people at the community level, we're still seeing that lag and we're still seeing that inequity. So I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but I can't say with confidence that this is going to be the thing that pulls us out of this hole. I think locally, we just have to be very careful to not get caught up in the tendency to move towards urgency without fixing things along the way. And what we've done locally is when we have things that are expedient or that are kind of already in place, we try to use those same vehicles to get to a new place. We need completely different vehicles. We need different structures, processes, different organizations participating in collaboratives. One of the things that's very promising about the regional response team is that we consistently have people from different sectors talking to each other about how to work together differently, but we need to see more of that, because if we're investing in the same infrastructure that we currently use, we're going to keep getting the same kind of results. And when you talk about especially the disproportionate impact, we did a panel for vaccine education, I think maybe last month for Women's History Month, and we had the executive director for Rung for Women, Leslie Gill, on the panel. And she shared some data because her organization focuses specifically on economic mobility for women that I thought was pretty startling. And I don't know if people really have started to examine just how much this pandemic has affected the ability of women to work. So one of the things that she relayed was that in December 2020, the US economy overall lost 146,000 jobs, and all of those jobs were women. So when we think about disproportionality, we really have to start thinking about issues around childcare, around social service supports that prevent women from really being able to move themselves and their families forward out of this pandemic. We can't have this, one size fits all, everybody gets the same thing approach. We need a strategy that hones in on the specific and unique needs of women that have been impacted by this pandemic.
I think that's a perfect segue into our next section. And David, if you want to, I think everyone here can talk a little bit about the pandemic's effect on families with children, especially women-led families or women in the workforce and taking care of small children. Let's talk a little bit about the prospects for the child tax credit and childcare reform.
I guess to thinking about the big thing from the rescue plan was a massive expansion and restructuring of the child tax credit expansion of the earned income tax credit, where it sort of plays as an experience of almost getting a child allowance. So I'm curious your take on the measure from expanding the tax credit so eligibility is broader, you're getting more money, and sort of the restructuring of it. And do you think that should be something that's adopted permanently? Just start there and anyone can comment.
Nisha?
Yeah, so in a word, yes, I do think it should be made permanent, but I definitely hear Serena's point. Like there's an urgency to move, but we've got to get the implementation right. I will say this to me feels like one of the most important policy advancements in my policy career so far. When I look at the predictive models, the American Rescue Plan taken together with the expanded child tax credit or income tax credit, unemployment expansion, SNAP together, that the estimates are that it would cut child poverty in half. But for that to happen, families actually have to get access. So that goes to Serena's point. You can have a great policy at the federal level, but what is happening in states? What is happening on the ground in St. Louis? Do families know about this wonky thing called the expanded advanced child tax credit? Probably not. So we have a bunch of folks who probably earn too little previously to file for taxes. So we got to make sure for those predictive models to be correct, we got to get people signed up. Now, I just was right before this, I was back on the IRS webpage, just figuring out, have they announced anything yet? Not yet. They've got to make clear how families will be able to access these advanced payments, whether that is through a portal. Now, in order to be eligible, they need to have filed their 2020 taxes. Now, that deadline is coming up in mid-May. So that's like a real-time thing on the ground. Make sure folks file their income taxes, even if they didn't earn enough to owe taxes, because that will then get them into that system, right? So that's got to happen. And then, yes, I do believe it should be made permanent, but we should really learn from this next year. And, the Treasury Department, IRS needs to figure out how do we make this easy for families? Again, we don't want to design another system that has something that looks like a bug that is actually a feature that it's hard for people to access. If we want this to work, we've got to have an easy way for families to access that benefit and access it on a monthly basis if they choose, or a lump sum if they choose. And so, we heard last night and we saw in the summary of the American Families Plan that the President Biden has put out, which is to extend it for 5 years. I think that's a start, but 5 years is not permanent. Like, never take anything for granted, especially when it comes to tax policy in Washington. And so I think 5 years is a step, but there's more work to be done to say that it's permanent.
And I just want to jump in here quickly. I know we're coming up on time, and I want to leave time for the Q&A to say I agree with everything that Nisha just said. I think this is one of the most exciting tax policy innovations I've seen, and policy innovations in general that I've seen in my career. So I fully support it. I think child poverty impacts so many aspects of child and adult well-being, education, health, future earnings. And it's difficult to overstate the impacts of child poverty. So I love this bill. I do want to frame the overall problem, though, which is functionally that imagine if tomorrow policymakers just announced that they were going to impose a 30% tax on any woman who decided to have a child. There would be riots in the streets, right? Everyone would lose their mind. There would be an overhaul of even just like who is in government. But that's functionally what we have today, which is that women who on average are more educated lose 30% of their income if they have a child, just on average. So that functionally translates to a 30% tax on a woman for choosing to have a child. That is huge. That is a huge tax, and implemented in the most regressive way possible, which is it falls specifically on a group of people. And so if you think about what a 30% tax rate looks like, that's tens of thousands of dollars on average for a woman every year. You think about that compounded over the course of a life, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars in many cases. So while the child tax credit is good, and I fully support it, I think ultimately it's going to be insufficient to deal with these equity issues in isolation, which none of us are saying that we should only do that, right? But it has to be part of a broader suite of policies around universal pre-K, subsidized childcare, and paid family leave. And we can talk about those all day. We don't have time to, but I do think that those need to be part of the conversation. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that the Biden administration has actually recently released, I think, just a preliminary outline of a package, but still an outline nonetheless, touching on all these issues. So again, cautiously optimistic.
Stephen, I just want to pick up on something you said about the importance of making sure that this is done in a comprehensive way. Because even though it makes sense to us that we shouldn't look at these as single funding streams or single programs, that's how they're likely going to be administered. So if you don't have someone at the administration level thinking about how to leverage these programs, how to make sure that they're complementary, that one incentivizes the other, you're going to end up with fragmentation, and it's going to diminish the return that you could experience if all of this was coordinated in a different way. One of the things that we experience, especially in the social sector, trying to work with all of these different units of government, is sometimes you'll have a government program that functionally disincentives you from working with another unit of government, just in the way that it's structured. So I think, at least locally, we should be keeping our eye on, as these different funding streams come down, what type of communication is happening between the different silos that currently exist in government, because we could squander an opportunity if we don't leverage the way that it's being allocated at this point.
I have to feel like I need to give a mic drop, because if people don't understand structural barriers and the way this works, that's Serena just delivered a mic drop. Because collectively, a lot of this could really work to lift families out of poverty and to sustain some of the safety net systems that we absolutely need, and not just for recovery, but as a functioning democracy, right? And yet there's a lot of structural barriers to the exact thing she's proposing and to the way this works. And unfortunately, some of those structural barriers are policy and at the hands of politics. So that's unfortunate. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to turn it back over to David. He's going to ask you some of your closing remarks, because we could go on and we really wish we could, but we want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah, I think the thread that I love from all three of you is it's how we do it, and ultimately what we build to get these things done is going to be extremely important. In thinking about equitable outcomes and disparate impact, what are some recommendations or suggestions you have for this administration to ensure that that is rooted in whatever the process is moving forward? Just your thought to centering racial equity and really centering those processes to reach those who are most vulnerable. What are some things that you would suggest?
So I'll start. I know that people really value autonomy and separation between different units of government, but I think it would be helpful if the federal government put out more of a roadmap, a blueprint, a playbook, whatever you want to call it, that can provide some guidance into how these different funding streams can be braided. And I know for folks who especially work in the behavioral health space, we talk about braided funding a lot because we understand there are certain things that public funding will support, other things that you have to have private payers for, and you need both of those things to achieve the specific outcome that you're trying to reach. So that's something that is familiar for folks that are in that space. But I think across the board, across different issues, that same approach would be helpful. And I appreciate the desire to make sure that people can make decisions at the local level, but I also recognize that some of the things that held us back, especially as we were trying to respond to the pandemic, was not having clear instructions from the federal level on how things could be allocated or how things could be done. So just being more proactive to offer guidance as we're moving through these different plans, I think would be paramount to success locally.
I might add on to that. Something else that trying to add on, and on a note of optimism, I'm optimistic about one of the executive orders that President Biden signed on day one, which is the executive order around advancing racial equity. I'm optimistic that there's work to be done, but the fact that that was put into writing with a clear deadline across federal agencies to have a racial equity assessment. And really get at what would it take to become an anti-racist federal government. But back to the earlier conversation that we were having, how does that then translate into state and local policy? Because it's a good thing. It needs to happen. Our federal government that we as taxpayers pay for should be anti-racist. But then how does, once that policy is passed, how does that get implemented? So that same type of assessment needs to be happening at the state and local level, but then those assessments have to be actionable. So are there some incentives or penalties? I don't know. Penalties get tricky because then you're cutting people out of needed services. But for state and local governments, Serena talked about guidance. What about guidance around implementing, spending that American Rescue Plan money in an anti-racist way? What does that look like? And what are the metrics for that? How are we going to hold our federal, state, and local governments accountable? And part of that starts with having folks at the table and really shifting power. So folks who are impacted by the policies, that their voices are at the table and are part of that decision making. So that's a big statement. So I'll stop there. Pass the mic.
Yeah, I will say that Nisha, that is the first time I've heard the word anti-racist and the phrase federal government in the same sentence together, and it was music to my ears. So I love that idea. Yeah, I think my recommendation would really be that, particularly with regard to, say, racial equity issues, when I review a lot of like the Biden administration's both implemented and proposed plans, a lot of them tend to be kind of indirect when it comes to dealing with racial equity. So it's things like, they want to promote or provide tax credits to help small businesses help their employees save for retirement. And this has a racial equity lens because of the racial wealth gap. I buy the argument. I'm not saying this is not a good thing, or that similar efforts supporting like community development, financial institutions, it's all good stuff. But a lot of these problems, the gender equity issues, the racial equity issues, they're too large and fundamental to be handled indirectly in any substantial way. And so I would hope that even once we're past this crisis and sort of like attention focusing piece of this crisis, that the Biden administration keeps going large and actually trying to like address some of these fundamental historical inequities directly and aggressively.
Wow, thank you. This has been incredible. I couldn't have asked, I knew when we asked you all together, this particular set of 3 people, this composition, that it would be an amazing conversation. And I really wish we had a lot more time, because I know you have so much more to share, and we had probably twice as many questions. But it's been a robust conversation. Honestly, I want to email the link to this to Biden's press secretary, our local, especially our local elected officials. I would really like to share this with them. So please help me in doing that once the recording becomes available. I'd like to thank our panelists, Serena, Nisha, Stephen. This has been amazing. I want to thank David, my co-moderator, and our producer, Janet Gillow at the Brown School Open Classrooms, and especially our sponsors, the Clark Fox Policy Institute and the Social Policy Institute and the Brown School. We are especially grateful also for those of you who joined us today and have made family well-being in this region a priority. And so thank you all. The recording will be available via the Brown School YouTube. I highly encourage you to watch this conversation again and to share it widely.
Awesome. Thank you all.